on a bitterly cold February morning in the year 1587. The grey skies of England hung low over the fortress of Fotheringhay Castle, where the frost clung stubbornly to the earth and the air itself seemed heavy with expectation. Inside those walls, history was preparing to witness a moment both unprecedented and shocking: the execution of a crowned queen. Mary Stuart Mary, Queen of Scots, who had once dazzled the courts of Europe with her beauty, her charm, and her royal blood, now prepared to walk to her death. She was not a common criminal, nor a defeated rebel dragged unwillingly to justice, but a woman born into sovereignty, consecrated by God's anointing, who had lived her entire life as both a symbol and a pawn in the violent struggles of her age. Her end was not to be swift, nor clean, nor merciful. What should have been a solemn conclusion to decades of imprisonment instead became one of the most grotesque and botched executions in the annals of English history. Yet to understand why Mary Stuart died that day, and why her death shocked not only England, but the whole of Europe, we must step back into her past, for her story is not one of a single moment, but of a lifetime shaped by ambition, betrayal, faith, and tragedy. Mary's story began at Linlithgow Palace in Scotland on December 8, 1542, where she was born the only surviving legitimate child of James V of Scotland and his French wife, Mary of Guise. Barely a week later, her father died, worn down by illness and defeat, leaving the infant Mary as Queen of Scotland before she had even opened her eyes to the world. From the very beginning, her life was not her own. She was a monarch in swaddling clothes, and with that crown came the burden of dynastic politics. Her bloodline gave her not only the throne of Scotland but also a potential claim to the throne of England, for through her grandmother Margaret Tudor, the sister of Henry VIII's Mary, carried Tudor blood. That single fact, invisible yet inescapable, would dictate her fate for as long as she lived. She was a rival to any Tudor monarch who ruled England. From her earliest years, Mary was marked out as a valuable prize on the chessboard of European politics. Scotland, small and fractured, needed strong allies, and so, at the age of 5, Mary was sent across the sea to France, betrothed to the young Dauphin Francois. There, in the glittering court of the Valois dynasty, she was raised in refinement, educated in languages, music, poetry, and statecraft, and adored for her beauty and wit. She grew into a tall, striking young woman with auburn hair and large, expressive eyes. At 16, she married Francois, and when he ascended the throne, Mary became Queen of France as well as Scotland. For a brief moment, it seemed her destiny was to rule both kingdoms, uniting France and Scotland under one crown. But fate was cruel. Francois died young, leaving Mary widowed and vulnerable. At 18, her dream vanished, and she returned to Scotland, a foreign queen in a divided land. Her return was anything but smooth. Scotland had changed while she was in France. The Protestant Reformation had taken hold, led by fiery preachers like John Knox, who railed against Catholicism and against Mary herself. She was a Catholic queen ruling over a kingdom where Protestant nobles were growing in power and confidence. Yet Mary, with her natural grace and charm, sought to balance these factions, tolerating Protestantism while holding firm to her Catholic faith. But her personal choices would soon undo her political carefulness. In 1565, she married her cousin, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Handsome, vain, and ambitious, Darnley seemed at first a suitable match, but their marriage quickly soured. Darnley resented Mary's authority and demanded more power, while Mary grew disillusioned with his arrogance and immaturity. Their union, however, produced a son, James, born in 1566, who would later become James VI of Scotland and James I of England, uniting the crowns his mother and cousin had fought over. Yet even the birth of an heir could not stabilize Mary's reign. The murder of David Rizzio, Mary's secretary and confidant, in front of her own eyes in 1566, was a turning point. Darnley, jealous of Rizzio's influence, conspired with nobles to stab him to death while Mary, pregnant with James, was forced to watch. Though she forgave Darnley publicly, their marriage never recovered. The following year, Darnley was murdered in mysterious circumstances, his house blown up, his body found strangled in the garden. Suspicion immediately fell on James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, and shockingly, within weeks, Mary married him. To her enemies, it seemed a confession of guilt. Whether Mary loved Bothwell, was forced into the marriage, or saw it as a desperate political maneuver remains debated, but the scandal was too great. The Scottish nobles rebelled, her armies deserted her, and she was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son. Captured and imprisoned in Loch Leven Castle, Mary eventually escaped, but her attempt to regain her throne failed. With nowhere left to turn, she fled across the border into England, seeking the protection of her cousin Elizabeth I. Elizabeth's position was complicated. As Queen of England, she had every reason to see Mary as a threat. Mary's claim to the English throne was legitimate in the eyes of many Catholics, who regarded Elizabeth as illegitimate due to her father Henry VIII's controversial marriage to Anne Boleyn. Yet Elizabeth was also wary of setting a dangerous precedent by deposing or killing a fellow anointed sovereign. Initially, Mary was received with courtesy, but courtesy soon gave way to confinement. For 19 years, she lived as a prisoner, shuttled between castles and manors, always under guard but never entirely silenced. To Catholics in England and across Europe, Mary was the rightful queen, the champion of their faith. To Elizabeth's ministers, particularly Sir Francis Walsingham, she was a dangerous conspirator whose mere existence invited rebellion. Throughout her captivity, plots swirled around her name: the Rodolphi plot, the Throckmorton plot, and finally, the Babington plot. In each case, Catholic conspirators sought to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. In each case, Mary's involvement was murky, her letters and actions subject to interpretation. But in 1586, the Babington plot proved fatal. Anthony Babington, a young Catholic nobleman, corresponded with Mary about a plan to kill Elizabeth. Walsingham's spies intercepted the letters, and whether Mary explicitly sanctioned Elizabeth's assassination or merely acknowledged the scheme was irrelevant. For her enemies, it was enough. She was arrested, tried for treason, and condemned to death. Elizabeth hesitated. She knew that executing Mary was unprecedented, for never before had an anointed queen been put to death by legal process. She feared the reaction of Catholic Europe, the wrath of Spain, and even the judgment of God. For weeks, she delayed signing the warrant, hoping somehow to avoid responsibility. But her ministers pressed her relentlessly, and at last, in February 1587, the warrant was signed. On the evening of February 7th, Mary was informed of her fate. She received the news with calm dignity, saying she was prepared to die. She spent the night in prayer, writing farewell letters, distributing her few possessions among her servants, and committing her soul to God. She forgave her enemies, declaring she would die in the Catholic faith. Those who saw her that night were struck by her composure, by the regal bearing that had never left her despite years of captivity. The next morning, February 8th, dawned cold and gray. At 8 o'clock, officials came to escort her to the Great Hall. Mary dressed with deliberate care, wearing a gown of black velvet with a white veil. Beneath, hidden until the final moment, was a crimson gown, the color of Catholic martyrdom. At her waist hung a rosary, and in her hand she carried a crucifix. As she walked through the corridors, her attendants wept, but Mary remained calm, pausing to comfort them, to remind them that she was going to a better place on the Great Hall. A futhering, a scaffold had been prepared, 2 feet high and draped in black velvet. Upon it stood the block and the axe, grim symbols of what was to come. Nobles, officials, and witnesses filled the hall, their faces solemn. When Mary entered, silence fell. All eyes turned to her as she mounted the scaffold with measured steps. Her crimes were read aloud, but she paid little heed, her lips moving in silent prayer. When asked if she had last words, she declared her innocence of treason, affirmed her Catholic faith, and forgave those who had brought her to this end. Then came the moment that stunned those present. Assisted by her ladies, she removed her outer gown. Gasps rippled through the hall as the crimson silk beneath was revealed. It was a deliberate choice, a statement to all who watched and to all who would hear of it. She would die not as a traitor, but as a martyr for her faith. Kneeling before the block, she arranged her skirts with care, kissed her crucifix, and forgave the executioner. "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit," she whispered in Latin. The executioner, masked and waiting, lifted his axe high. The hall held its breath. After 44 years of life, after crowns won and crowns lost, after marriages, scandals, betrayals, and 19 years of captivity, Mary Stuart's long journey had come to this final moment. The axe fell, but what followed was not the clean, swift ending expected. Instead, history would remember the scene as one of the most harrowing and botched executions ever carried out. A grotesque spectacle that turned Mary, Queen of Scots, from prisoner into martyr, and left those who witnessed it haunted forever. The Hall of Futhering was deathly still, the silence so absolute that one could hear the creak of the wooden scaffold beneath Mary Stuart's steps. Moments earlier, she had transformed herself from prisoner to martyr, revealing beneath her mourning gown the vivid crimson of Catholic sacrifice, a deliberate gesture meant to echo across centuries. She knelt with calm composure, placed her head upon the block, whispered prayers in Latin, and forgave the man who was about to end her life. For the assembled witnesses, nobles, officials, soldiers, and a handful of carefully chosen commoners, this was a moment of history unfolding before their eyes. A crowned queen, granddaughter of Henry VII, former Queen of France, and sovereign of Scotland, was about to be executed like a common traitor. The axe lifted high. The silence deepened. Then came the first blow. It was not clean. It was not merciful. The executioner's axe missed the slender neck and instead crashed into the back of Mary's skull with a sickening crack. Gasps erupted from the crowd, muffled cries from women who could not believe what they had witnessed. Mary moaned softly, a sound of human pain that tore through the solemn atmosphere like a knife. Blood began to spread across the black velvet of the scaffold, dripping onto the floor below. The executioner, his hands shaking, raised the axe again. This time it struck closer to the mark, but still failed to sever completely, leaving her neck half attached, skin and sinew stubbornly holding. Horror gripped the room. Some witnesses turned away, others wept openly, while a few stood frozen in disbelief. The solemn ritual of justice had become a grotesque butchery. The executioner, sweating and trembling, raised the axe a third time and swung with desperate force. Finally, the blow completed the task, separating Mary's head from her body in a spray of blood. The sound of the blade hitting would reverberated like a death knell, but even in death, humiliation was not finished. When the executioner bent to lift Mary's head and display it to the crowd, the auburn curls came away in his hands. It was a wig. Her real hair, thin and gray from years of suffering, was revealed to all. Gasps of shock echoed once more as the illusion of the once beautiful queen fell away, replaced by the reality of a woman aged beyond her years. To compound the pathos of the scene, Mary's small Skye Terrier suddenly darted from beneath her skirts, whimpering its white fur, soaked in her blood. The tiny creature ran around the scaffold in panic, searching for its mistress. Witnesses later said it was the most pitiful sight of all, the loyalty of an innocent animal that refused to abandon her even in death. Some men wiped their eyes. Others cursed the barbarity they had just witnessed. Robert Melville, her faithful secretary, could barely stand from grief, later writing that it was the most sorrowful spectacle that ever Christian man beheld. News of the disaster traveled fast. Elizabeth I, waiting in Greenwich, was informed within hours. Her courtiers claimed she fainted upon hearing the details, then swiftly recovered to demand explanations. To her foreign ambassadors, Elizabeth pretended outrage, insisting she had not meant for the warrant to be carried out so hastily. But her protestations rang hollow. To Catholic Europe, the image of Mary dying with dignity while Protestant officials bungled her execution became propaganda of immense power. In Spain, King Philip II seized upon the moment, declaring Mary a martyr and using her death as justification for the armada he was already preparing to unleash against England. Pamphlets spread across France and Italy, describing in lurid detail the blood-soaked scaffold, the trembling executioner, and the loyal dog stained with its mistress's blood. Mary, who in life had been a political pawn, in death became a saintly figure, her crimson dress the symbol of sacrifice, her composure a testament of faith. Even Protestants found the spectacle troubling. The Earl of Shrewsbury, who had overseen Mary's captivity, trembled visibly during the execution and later sent Elizabeth a report conspicuously vague about the details. Local witnesses, carefully selected by the Crown to spread the justice of Mary's death, instead carried stories of horror back to their villages. A blacksmith present told neighbors he had expected to see justice, but instead saw butchery most foul, unfit for any Christian soul. Elizabeth's government tried to suppress such accounts, but the damage was done. The narrative slipped from their control. Mary was no longer a traitor. She was a martyr. Her son, James VI of Scotland, faced a delicate balancing act. He had long courted Elizabeth's favor, knowing his eventual inheritance of the English throne depended on her goodwill. Publicly, he protested his mother's execution, but only in carefully worded letters that satisfied neither Scottish pride nor Catholic expectation. Privately, he accepted her death as the price of his political future. To many Scots, this was betrayal. To historians, it was cold pragmatism. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's court scrambled to contain the fallout. Investigations were launched into the accident of the botched execution, but no serious blame was placed. The executioner himself disappeared from records, some claiming he killed himself in shame, others whispering he had been silenced by officials desperate to erase the embarrassment. Rumors spread that his ghost haunted the roads near Fotheringay, cursed to forever swing his axe in vain. Superstition aside, the professional reputation of executioners across England suffered. Condemned nobles in later years often begged for alternative methods of death rather than risk the fate Mary had endured. For Catholic Europe, the story became part of sacred memory. Preachers spoke of Mary as a second Joan of Arc, a queen who died not for treason, but for faith. In Rome, Pope Sixtus V, previously cautious about supporting her, now praised her openly. In paintings and ballads, the image of the crimson-clad queen kneeling in prayer circulated widely. Her terrier, whimpering in blood, became a symbol of loyalty in the face of cruelty. Within decades, Mary was venerated in Catholic communities as a martyr, her execution remembered as proof of Protestant barbarity. In England, the memory of the execution carried a different weight. To Protestants, it was proof that Elizabeth's government would stop at nothing to protect the realm. To Catholics, it was proof that Elizabeth's regime was built on cruelty. For centuries afterward, the scaffold at Fothering remained infamous, a place where sacred monarchy had been defiled. The consequences rippled far beyond England. Philip II's armada sailed the following year with banners of Mary's martyrdom. Those storms and English resistance destroyed the fleet. Yet, even in defeat, the image of Mary's death continued to inspire resistance movements and shape the politics of Europe. In literature and art, she became immortal, a tragic heroine who had suffered indignity, yet maintained her dignity. The botched execution only amplified her legend. The story resonates to this day because it captures universal truths about power, faith, and humanity. Mary's enemies intended to erase her as a political problem. Instead, through incompetence and cruelty, they elevated her into legend. Her death shattered the illusion that royal blood was sacred and untouchable, paving the way for future regicides, including that of Charles I, half a century later. And yet, beyond politics, her story endures because of the human details: the crimson dress, the trembling axe, the wig falling away, the faithful dog crying for its mistress. These images transcend religion and politics. They speak to the essence of loyalty, suffering, and grace. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, died not once but 3 times upon that scaffold, once with the first failed blow, again with the second, and finally with the third that ended her life. Yet, in another sense, she did not die at all. In death, she was transformed. From a disgraced prisoner, she became a martyr. From a political pawn, she became a legend. And though centuries have passed, the echoes of her final mourning in castle still haunt history, reminding us that the line between justice and cruelty is perilously thin, and that even in the shadow of death, dignity can outlast brutality.